Welcome to the MS&Me Radio Network. The broadcast shows are for informational and entertainment purposes only. They are not designed to provide listeners with specific personal, medical, or counseling advice. Individuals with a medical issue should always consult their healthcare provider. MS&Me is not responsible for content of individual shows. The views expressed by show hosts or the guests are their own. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to YEG MS, episode number 40. It's been pretty much since the beginning of summer since the last time I recorded one of these, and I had a busy summer. So I've started training for next year's really long-term MS, and it's going good. A really good friend of mine, Mark, who's actually an ultra marathoner. He and I about 2 weeks ago started finding the trail from Fort Saskatchewan to Edmonton. So once we get in Edmonton, we should be pretty good. And so yeah, I'm running almost every day. Starting next week, I'm going to try to attempt to run 10K every day, Monday through Friday, and then take the weekends off. So that's going well. I'm pretty excited. And one of the local radio stations here, Cruise 95.7, has already had me on a couple times to talk about the run. So it's nice to have the support. And then we went out to Kamloops for a week. And got caught in the middle of the forest fires out there. We had a few really nice days on East Barrier Lake, and then one day my friend Adam, whose land it is, he's got a floating dock, and it's got a little space on the back for a small outboard motor. And we would take the kids swimming. We'd drive the dock out into the middle of the lake, and the kids would jump off, and it was pretty fun. So the last day we were there, we were doing that, and it wasn't a planned last day because it was fairly clear when we took the dock out, and then just from the southwest side of the lake, the smoke just it came in so quickly. It was unreal. And we decided to go back to shore, and probably 10 minutes after we got the kids, sorted out, Adam came up to me and he said, would you mind going back into Kamloops tonight rather than tomorrow? And I said, no, I can't see why we wouldn't. I mean, the smoke was so thick, it wasn't healthy to be outside. And when we got into Kamloops, by the time because we're about an hour and a bit out of town, by the time we got into Kamloops, the smoke was so thick you could almost not see the house across the street. Now, for those of you that don't live in Canada and have no idea what I'm talking about, the westernmost province in Canada, British Columbia, is just covered by forest and mountains. And for the second consecutive summer, they've had an unreal amount of forest fires. And we thankfully we weren't in a fire, but we definitely got caught in the smoke while I was out there. And then we got back from Kamloops. It was still a nice trip, and kind of got back to things here in Edmonton. And long weekend was last weekend here, Labor Day long weekend. And now we're into September. It was actually my friend's Mark, who's been helping me with the really long run. It was his wedding over the weekend. And he it was a really cool way that they did their wedding. I kind of wish that I would have been at their wedding before I got married 8 years ago, because they just had a lot of really good ideas, and they had the whole wedding in one spot. It was very relaxed and casual and fun, and really good people. Now, Mark is an ultra runner, and I met him through doing the really long run. And, this is a guy that does the solo of the death race. And for those of you who aren't familiar, the death race is in Cache Creek, Alberta. And I believe, and forgive me if I have this incorrect, but I believe it's 120 kilometers plus run. And you go up two mountains, so you hit two peaks. And, I don't know what the guys that finish first time at, but people I've talked to, I mean, you're running for anywhere from like 20 to 24 hours. So it's makes the 80 kilometer runs that I've done seem a little silly by comparison. Which was interesting, because at the table I was at the wedding, several of the people at the table were some of Mark's running buddies, and these are people who do 100-milers, not kilometers, miles. And yeah, I mean, like I said, I don't suspect the an 80-kilometer run on a flat prairie would be much of a challenge for these guys. But it was really cool to talk to them and kind of learn different perspectives and be able to ask questions from people who've actually taken it past where I have. And hopefully I didn't sound like too much of a moron, but I can never guarantee myself that. Now, also over the summer, and this is really what the episode's going to be about, is I've been reading a book called Forgotten Civilization by Dr. Robert Schoch. He's a geologist from the Boston University, and some of you may be familiar with him. He started a major flap with archaeologists about 20 years ago, when he redated the Sphinx to be a lot older. The Sphinx at the Giza Plateau will be a lot older than what archaeologists commonly think. Now, you may be wondering why I mention a book like this. Well, it'll come clear as we go along, but just a little background. This isn't something I've ever talked about on the podcast before, but personally, and I have an interest in very ancient history, and I read a lot of alternative history. Books by gentlemen like Graham Hancock, Robert Bauval. A really fascinating book called Forbidden Archaeology. Things like that. And before any of my regular listeners get scared and think that I'm a tinfoil hat wearing ancient aliens guy, I'm not. In fact, none of the authors that I read think that aliens or the little green men came down and built the pyramids, nothing like that. I just, there's the traditional approach to things, there's the alternative approach to things, and I'm not really in either camp. I'm curious. I'm a curious person, and some of the stuff. Going through high school, then university, that I was exposed to was never really that convincing for me. So anyway, as with everything, I question it, and I like to find out more. So that's what brought me to Dr. Schoch's book. And so why I'm mentioning it on the podcast here is a number of years ago, I wrote a post, not a podcast, this was a post on my blog, and it was about a paper I had read called Geomagnetic Disturbances and Multiple Sclerosis. And it was by a couple doctors, one by the name of Saeed Eddin Sajede, and the other guy's name is Fahime Abudallah. And it was published in BMC Neurology in 2012. And my reason, and how that came to be is actually one of the doctors on the study. He'd actually emailed me the paper. He had been on my he'd been on my blog, liked some of the stuff that I'd written, and thought I might find it interesting. So he emailed me the paper. And he emailed me a paper after he read the blog post I had written about it. Excuse me. But anyway, I initially found the paper on PubMed. If you want to look at all kinds of different academic research from numerous academic journals, just type into your search engine PubMed.org or PubMed, and it'll come up. And you can get all kinds of free academic journals. There's a lot of paid ones too, but a lot of them are free. So anyway, that's where I get a lot of stuff that I read. And what geomagnetic disturbances and multiple sclerosis basically was about is, as a lot of you already know, and I've probably mentioned it, there is a prevailing theory in the multiple sclerosis community about vitamin D and where do we get most of our vitamin D, and a lot of us are vitamin D deficient, and we get it from sunlight. And then you see that a lot of MS cases are more prevalent in northern latitudes. So since we get from sunlight, it seemed like a pretty reasonable hypothesis, right? Well, these two doctors in this paper show that, yes, while MS rates are higher in the northern latitudes, that's not true in the southern latitudes, and they should be similar if the vitamin D hypothesis were correct. And what they know is these geomagnetic disturbances can be charted like latitude, but instead of being straight lines, they are curved. And I think it's around 66 degrees north and 66 degrees south. I'd have to reread the paper. It's something like that. That correlates a lot tighter with MS distribution than does vitamin D. And then they go on to note in the paper that MS rates have been on the rise, obviously in the last century and in this one. And the other thing that they note in the paper is there has been, and this is a quote, exceptional solar activity since 70 years ago that is unprecedented in the last 8,000 years. Which brings me back to Dr. Schock and why I'm mentioning his book. While I would love to do a podcast on the pyramids and the Sphinx and Teotihuacan, and the list goes on, that's not what this podcast is about. However, in his book, Forgotten Civilization, Schock talks about how cataclysmic events could have reset civilization several times. Again, that's not the point of this. But what he was pointing out is that there was a sudden and drastic change in climate about 12,000 years ago. And other authors, and we all know, we know this from Greenland ice cores. We know this, there's data out there. We know that this is true, that obviously the last ice age ended. And, some other people have claimed that it was comets that hit the ice sheets. There's all kinds of theories out there as to why the ice went away and we moved into, roughly the weather that we've had in the last, 8 to 12,000 years, give or take. But the thing that caught my eye, so that's the part of the book I was reading, was he starts to talk about how, you know, activity from the sun can cause these cataclysmic events. And he was talking about how, you know, 10, 12,000 years ago, there was a lot of sunspot activity and the sun was very, very active. But what caught my eye was he mentioned that the sun is more active right now than at any point since the end of the last ice age, which parallels what that paper I referenced earlier, geomagnetic disturbances and multiple sclerosis. So it was very, very interesting to me that reading about two completely separate things. One was a book about lost civilizations, and the other one was a paper written by two doctors about the potential link between geomagnetic disturbances and multiple sclerosis. But in both sources, they talk about how in the last century we're seeing unprecedented levels of solar activity. And then you start thinking about, well, how drastically the weather's changing. You know, I read out from the outset of this podcast, I mentioned the forest fires in British Columbia and how the last 2 summers in British Columbia have been the worst in terms of forest fires since they started recording that data. And I grew up in Kamloops. I didn't grow up in Edmonton. I grew up in Kamloops. I grew up in British Columbia. And I don't recall the fires ever being that bad. Yeah, you'd hear about forest fires, but never to the point where you'd walk out your front door and you couldn't see the house across the street because the smoke was so thick. I don't remember that ever happening when I was a kid. I mean, maybe some of you out there listening, maybe I'm wrong. But even here in Edmonton, I don't recall not having to shovel as much. I mean, there's just not as much snow as there used to be. And granted, this is anecdotal, but I mean, I'm sure it can be backed up by data. I mean, I can remember shoveling, and not just when I was a kid, because then people say, well, you're smaller, you wouldn't remember, or it would have seemed bigger. No, I mean, I can remember shoveling in my late teens and early 20s, and there was more snow than there, and that was 20 odd years. I'm 41 now. And there was more snow. I remember more days of minus 30. And this isn't a podcast about climate change, but certainly we're aware that the climate's changing, and I don't want to get into debate as to the reasons why, but it is. But wouldn't that be fascinating if there's a link between this shift in climate and this, which could be caused by this solar activity? Or the solar activity is going on, and the last time the sun was that active, the ice caps melted. But wouldn't that be fascinating? And I don't know if fascinating is the right word, but because MS is certainly not a positive thing. But can you imagine if it turns out that it's the sun, and that. In this book, he was talking about solar winds and all this. I mean, you'd have to be a scientist at that level to be able to understand. But it was just really neat to me that there's potentially a link between what we're seeing going on in the climate and the sun and MS and. Now, this is all stuff you can read on your own. You can check out Dr. Robert Schoch's book. You can go to PubMed and find the geomagnetic disturbances in multiple sclerosis paper. And I know they've got several other papers. And if you go to my own multiplesclerosis.com website and if you click on sources, I have all the papers there. I mean, these are from academic journals. This isn't fringe science or anything like that. Now, however, it's not accepted. I mean, this is not an accepted theory. If you talk to your neurologist about it, he'd probably look at you sideways. I mean, a lot of neurologists won't even talk about vitamin D. So you can imagine talking about magnetic field and sunspot activity. I mean, I've had enough neurologists roll their eyes at me in my life that, I'm used to it. But, if you were to ask them about it, I'm sure they probably either haven't heard of it, or they're not, or they would just kind of like shrug it off. Now, I don't know if people are wondering, I don't think that you think maybe, you should wear sunblock, if that's somehow going to help. That's not what they're talking about. It's a magnetic field, and then change it with it. And I remember from the paper, they were showing how these magnetic fields and changes in them can affect the mitochondria. And if any of you are familiar with Dr. Terry Walls and her TED Talk or her books on nutrition and MS, and how she went from a wheelchair to walking again, through basically a very extreme form of the paleo diet. All this stuff I've talked about or written about on my blog, so I'm not going to really rehash it all. But it was interesting to me that in the paper, Geomagnetic Disturbances and Multiple Sclerosis, they mentioned how that could be potentially damaging to mitochondrial health. And the Walls therapy or diet or whatever we want to call it is focused around trying to help your mitochondria heal. So is there connections between any of this stuff? I don't know. I mean, but that's what these podcasts are for. It's to throw out ideas. It's to be part of a community. It's to listen to different, is there a therapy here? I doubt it. I don't know. That's not why I brought it up. I find it interesting, and I don't think it hurts to snoop around and look and see what's out there and that. So, which probably brings me to my closing point. And there's a high level of irony to what I'm about to say. But whether it's me or some other person or some other blog or a YouTube video, I don't know, whatever it is, we shouldn't take things at face value. You shouldn't listen to what I'm talking about, some crazy theories about magnetic fields and solar activity and so forth. This is all stuff that my personal feeling is, as an individual, you're responsible for yourself. So if you're listening to something I have to say, I would hope that you would at least verify it and check to see that I got this from somewhat reasonable sources, and I'm not just talking out of my butthole. And I'm not presenting any truths here. What I'm presenting is ideas. And I know I've noticed that it's really hard these days to talk about ideas. It actually comes back to something I used to tell the sales guys that used to work for me. It's really hard to listen with your mouth open. And what I meant by that is if you're just waiting to talk, to get your point out, you're not listening. Which means you've already decided how the world exists for you. So all your biases, all your preconceived notions, all the nonsense you get from, media, you're ready to pounce on anything that challenges that paradigm. So you're not listening, you're waiting to shoot. And what I find really depressing as I, look online and see what's happening in the world. 20 years ago when I went to university, it was a safe place to talk about ideas. That was what it was for, is to teach you how to critically think and talk about ideas. And not all those ideas were comfortable. Not all those ideas I initially agreed with or even came to agree with, but that wasn't the point. Now it seems if any idea doesn't fit a consensus view, however erroneous it might be, you get immediately attacked. Even though you're not trying to present the truth, you're trying to present an idea based on other information that doesn't necessarily fit the mainstream. I don't know, maybe I'm nuts. But I think we should be able to talk about ideas without getting attacked. And that's what this is for. Here's some ideas, here's some, stuff that you probably hadn't heard. Check it out, don't check it out. That's up to you. I found it interesting, so there it is. Anyways, that's it for me. It won't be 2 months again before I record another one. Summer's over, I'm back into the grind. Both my kids are in school, so it's back to that Monday to Friday over-programmed time of the year, I guess. So I'll have more time to... Well, it's not that I don't have more time, but I have time that'll be available to do more of these. So expect another one in 2 weeks. And as always, if you have any questions, comments, etc., you can send an email to Sean@ownmultiplesclerosis.com, SEAN @ownmultiplesclerosis.com. If you want to check out that blog post for that the paper I mentioned, just search for it. Go to the ownmultiplesclerosis.com, and you'll be able to find it. If you want to follow me on Twitter, it's @ownms.com1. If you're in Hinton this weekend for the Jasper MS bike, if you see me, come up, say hello, all that great stuff. Anyways, that is it for me. We'll talk to everybody in about 2 weeks. Take care.